Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, German-Brazilian Panorama on the inclusion of people with disabilities in the labor market. First of all, I would like to describe myself to those with visual impairment. My name is Marco Silva. I am a man with brown skin, a full black beard, short black hair, and I'm wearing a gray shirt. Mrs. Kathleen Bieling and Mrs. Tabata Fernandes are joining us today as interpreters for German Sign Language and Brazilian Sign Language, respectively. This event is a joint production between myself and Dr. Jonas Carvalho. We are both from Brazil and are German Chancellor Fellows of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. I am researching exactly the same subject of this webinar at the Münster District Government and have as my host there Mr. Uwe Eisenberg, Senior Government Director. Dr. Jonas Carvalho, on the other hand, is researching social and emotional development of communities impacted by large-scale infrastructure projects at the TU Dortmund, with his host, Professor Dr. Christoph de Oliveira Kepler. As you can see, both of our work is bounded by the subjects of business and human rights. For the organization of this event, we also had the support of the Working Group on Human Rights of Amnesty International at the TU Dortmund, today represented here by Mr. Niklas Kedding. We will have as guest speakers Mr. Cid Torquato, President of ICOM Libras in Brazil, and former Secretary of the People with Disabilities in the city of São Paulo, and Mr. Frieder Kurbjeweit, Associate Researcher of the German Institute for Human Rights and a specialist in disability policy. They will talk about the present situation of the inclusion of people with disabilities in the labor market, both in Brazil and Germany. After their presentations, we kindly invite Mr. Uwe Eisenberg and Professor Dr. Christoph de Oliveira Kepler to briefly comment on the subject. In conclusion, we will dedicate the last half hour of our event to questions from the audience. If you are watching from Zoom, please write your questions in the chat. If you are following from YouTube, please write questions in the comment section. Inclusion of people with disabilities is a subject that concerns society as a whole, not only those individuals with disabilities and their families. Therefore, we would like to present at this event a broad perspective on the matter, especially regarding inclusion in the labor market. Our objective is to build bridges between Germany and Brazil in this area, looking for possibilities of cooperation and exchange of concerns, ideas, and solutions. By the way, the last edition of the Humboldt Cosmos magazine, this one here, addresses the theme of diversity in science, which includes people with disabilities. I would like to quote a small part of an article in this magazine, written by Kilian Kirchgessner. He says, "Long live diversity. The more heterogeneous the researchers in a team, the more creative the results. If substitute researchers for workers, this sentence also describes how diversity and inclusion can positively impact the general labor market." Before we start with the presentations of our guest speakers, I would like to invite Dr. Jonas Carvalho to say a few words as welcome to our event. Please, Jonas. Thank you very much, Jonas. And for our first presentation, I would like to invite Cid Torquato. We had the honor to work together a few years ago at the German Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, writing an inclusion guide between Germany and Brazil. It's an honor to have you here, Cid. Please, you have the word. You have 10 minutes. When we are reaching about 8-9 minutes, I let you know so you can finish properly. Thank you very much. I think it's code law in English as well.
That persons with disabilities should be, should be treated with privilege, or should be should have any special treatment, like in other countries. But good news is that we didn't have the chain deaths that countries like France and Spain and even the United States have showed. I mean, we didn't have here in Brazil like a whole clinic, a whole how to say, the houses that these clinics that many times host persons with disabilities. We at least in São Paulo, but I heard from other states as well, that we were able to protect these institutions, and there were no great number of deaths. We heard from Europe and from the United States that it was the case in many clinics of elderly and persons with disabilities. So we were able to protect them, particularly. Another very important law that came up last year in order to protect persons with disabilities with Disabilities as well, it stated the emergency program to maintain jobs and income of persons with disabilities. So a law was passed last year in the middle of the pandemic, protecting the jobs, protecting persons with disabilities that have jobs according to the quote law. So companies are not allowed to fire persons with disabilities during the pandemic, which I think was a very important measure because but even with this law, we know that many persons with disabilities were fired before any other group, any other, much before persons without disabilities.
Cid, if you can conclude in the next 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, sure. I'm heading to that. And that's it. I mean, basically, we have a very well-intentioned law, and now our greatest challenge is how to have more people being hired to and the challenge is it requires more investments in capacitation and investments in assistive technologies, which companies haven't really figured out as yet. I mean, everything is happening very much now. So I think that this is about all that I had to say, and I will save some more for questions if people have more questions regarding Brazil. But I think I gave an overall idea of how we're dealing with the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the labor market.
Cid, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to apologize people from YouTube because we had a technical problem with the audio. But I will be recording this, the beginning of our presentation, and I will be putting it on my website after, so that you that lost the first part of it can reach it after. And we have here as well Mr. Niklas Kleding from Amnesty International. He was not in the beginning of our conversation. I will invite him to say a few words before we pass the word to Mr. Frida Kurbjeweit. Niklas, if you could please say some words regarding the Amnesty International Dortmund.
You hear me, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we can hear you.
So, good evening, everybody. There were technical problems. I don't know what it was. Then I will start a little late with my introductory words. My name is Niklas Kleding, and I'm from the Amnesty International University Group Dortmund. Amnesty International is an organization that campaigns for human rights around the world. Everyone has the right to inclusion, that is, to be an equal part of society, and this is what it says in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been in force in Germany since 2009. As a human right, inclusion is directly linked to the claims to freedom, equality, and solidarity. Inclusion is therefore both an independent right and an important principle without whose application the enforcement of human rights remains incomplete, I think. Like all other human rights, the right to inclusion is based on universal human dignity, but there's still a long way, I think, to go from legal to actual equality for disabled people. So I'm very pleased that we as an Amnesty International University group can hopefully help to break down the barriers in people's minds by making human rights, disability and inclusion a topic here in this webinar and taking a closer look.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Now I would like to invite Mr. Frieder Kurbjeweit to do his presentation. I will be screening his presentation from my computer. So I would like to ask the other participants, besides the two interpreters, Cid and Frieder, to stop their videos so that the thumbnails can fit in the screen for people who are watching from YouTube as well. Frieder, I will just open the presentation and you have the word. Thank you very much for your presence, first of all.
Yeah, well, thank you, Marco, for the introduction and for the invitation. There's actually not that much and nothing on the presentation that I'm not going to say out loud. So if that takes some time, no problem. I'll just go ahead and start. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to this big and interesting group of people. Thank you, Cid, also for your input, because that saved me a lot of time. I also only have 10 minutes, so I'll jump right into it. I will try to give you an intro into German disability employment politics. I hope that I find the right balance between saying something general and quick, and yet giving you an interesting perspective that you can profit from. Cid already touched on that. I'll not go ahead and show you charts and numbers about the employment situation in Germany, because disability is always so hard to measure. So we will need to talk about what the German state counts as disabled, what they count as employment, how to interpret data that, of course, in Germany, because we have such an old society, is heavily skewed in terms of age, and also different forms of impairment. So that would be very messy and would probably not do our task here a great service. And it's also that it's very similar to the situation in Brazil. Basically, that's a global problem, of course. Unemployment, underemployment, low pay, discrimination in the workplace, that is pretty global thing. What I think is more interesting is the specific situation in Germany, also for the comparison of the two countries. And I will try to give you an overview of the causes, why it's also so problematic in Germany, and why we are struggling so hard to reform our system. Let me say so much, the situation in Germany is also dire. It's very bad in terms of the employment of disabled people. And we find that that's the case even after basically 15 years of constant economic upswing, very low general unemployment. So even like in the best of all worlds, on the German labor market, disabled people are not doing well. I will go on and argue that this is because the German system is not compatible with a progressive or modern take on disability politics. In the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, in Article 27, the states acknowledge that there's a right of persons with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others. That includes the right to the opportunity to gain a living by work freely chosen or accepted in a labor market, and in a work environment that's open, inclusive, and accessible to persons with disabilities. The convention itself is said to be, or it's a creation of the disabled people movement and its social model of disability. What we do when we apply a social model of disability is to differentiate between an individual impaired body and the social circumstances, the disabling social barriers as the disability on the other side. So we see disability as a problem of society and not a problem of an individual. For the disabled people's movement, employment, not only Germany, everywhere really, employment's always been a major issue. Why? So that's the reason why it's also was a very important topic when the convention was drafted. And there's really two reasons why it is so important. If you could go to the next slide, I'll try to give you a quick idea. First is plain integration, meaning that disabled people, if they work, they would be present in the community like everybody else instead of being secluded or segregated. So that's an idea of disability mainstreaming, really. So you should be able to live a life as everyone else. There should be, people should see disabled people in their workplace. They will hopefully have less prejudices and so on. They will take them for normal and so on. The main reason why it is so important for disabled people, though, is independent living. So we all live in societies where the ability to do as you like is directly linked to being able to spend money and to have your own income. So that's important, really. So we have these two reasons. First, to be part of the community on the ground, and then second, to a more abstract way, being able to spend your money and not to be dependent on other people. What follows is a bit of a simplistic analysis. You can go to the next slide. But I will try to argue that these two reasons are not the central ideas of German disability politics. So in Germany, we have always followed a different logic since the 1920s, when the first laws were made. Work has been seen primarily as a component of cure. So it was not so much the idea of integration or later inclusion, but that of rehabilitation. So that all was set up like after the two wars and centered on two groups really. First would be male wheelchair users, other physically impaired men really, oftentimes like missing a limb, where usually it would be try to restore their functionality first, put them back into their pre-impairment employment situation, using therapy and mobility aids. And if that didn't work, you would declare them unfit to work, and they would have to live off welfare. On the other hand, there are or were people with learning difficulties for whom work was considered to be of value as such. So it would be said that working itself would be good for them, would be beneficial for their life and even for their character. That was an idea in the 20s, and that actually kind of still is around. So for them, a large system of special institutions was set up where they would in many ways be treated as employees, but they wouldn't get paid. So that really put them in a situation where they would work, but they would not have that reason, like they wouldn't get money to spend of it. So we have a different logic here than what we would say today would be human rights reason to work. Those political instruments that were there to include people into the labor market were always very limited. They usually addressed physically and impaired and blind people. And of course, that's only a fraction of the total number of disabled people out there. And what really is the problem that we have until today is that It's always been a system based on individual rehabilitation and compensation if you were fit for employment. And we never really had a greater social strategy that would shape the labor market in a way that it would be better accessible for disabled people. That was never really on the agenda. And so since about 20 years, when human rights-based politics, disability politics became a thing, we've been struggling with that. So on the one hand, we have this huge workforce in the workshops, about 300,000 people. That's just under 1% of the overall German workforce. These people make about 10 to 20% of the minimum wage there. And also the workshops don't work as qualifiers for the labor market. Really, there's a very little transfer from the workshops to the labor market. And on the other hand, for those people who are not in a workshop, there's a problem that the measures to include them in the workforce are outdated, they are underdeveloped and also underfunded. So for example, personal assistance, so someone who would help you around in the workplace, is really still in its developmental stages in Germany. It's very hard to apply for, it takes a long time, it's very bureaucratic, so on. And also the German state has until now missed every opportunity to regulate the private market in terms of accessibility. So when you compare it to other countries of similar economic status, Germany is shockingly inaccessible. That is very inconvenient, of course, for disabled people in their everyday life, but it's also very problematic for their employment situation, because employing a disabled person in Germany oftentimes means needing to take measures that otherwise would not be necessary, so it's not very attractive. We have a quota system that also doesn't work. What I think is dim really is that there's no immediate political initiative to change any of that. We basically just had the last disability law reform and are coming out of an economic climate that was very beneficial, very favorable for the last 2 decades, and still the situation is so bad. And yeah, we will see now what happens as we go into economic decline after the crisis. The outlook is very, very dark at the moment.
Frida, if you can conclude in the last minute, please.
Yeah, I'm done. Thanks for the attention. And yeah, I'll get back to Marco. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida, very much. Now I invite everyone else to take on your cameras again. I would like to invite now for a briefly comment about the matter and about the 2 presentations we just saw, Mr. Uwe Eisenberg and Professor Dr. Christoph Oliveira Kepler. Please, you have the words. I think first, Uwe, you can say a few words now.
Yes, thank you very much, Marco. I'm also a handicapped person here. I am handicapped in English, and I hope I give my very best to say that what I want, and it will make me very great and glad when you understand what I want to say, okay? Marco, I say also, I'm a man. I have not so much hair like Marco, and my hair is gray and not so black like Marco's. And now to my words, I want to say thank you very much for your invitation to this great and very important digital event. Thanks to the speakers for the important impulse which animate us to reflect about us. Firstly, Brazil is an amazing country. The people I got to know in Brazil were rather awesome. Because of this, it makes me even more sad that so many people are doing badly based on Corona, and that there is such a huge number of deaths based on Corona. Let's hope together for a quick improvement of the situation. It would be wonderful visiting each other in the human countries again without any difficulties. As a representative of the district council, I am also responsible for the process of inclusion of all schools in the administrative district of Münster. This is an amazing mission because I'm convinced that inclusion makes our society sustained more humanly, more colorful, and more efficient. By now, we teach much more than 50% of pupils with handicap at common schools and not at special schools for handicapped pupils. Because of this, there is each year one released generation of pupils for whom the handling with handicapped pupil is absolutely normal. My hope is that these pupils are going to advocate handicapped pupil naturally, and that they are going to create inclusive jobs on the job market. Here we have 7 different handicaps which had relevance in the school. For people with certain handicaps, the possibilities on the first job market are in comparison good. So in our district council are people with physical and visual handicap, deaf people, or even people with physical handicaps. The same counts for teacher or for the community. The condition for people with complex handicaps or intellectual handicaps are very bad. Great that asking people from Brazil are coming to question us. This is absolutely a big benefit for us. It makes us reflecting structures. It seems inspiring. Marco, thank you for that. But also our visit in Brazil with a group of functionaries of the school supervision has been for us a travel of further education. There are so many experiences which impressed me in long term. The handling of shop assistants with handicapped people in the supermarket. It has been patient and respectful. The pragmatismus in the kindergarten, handling with children with autism. The team of the favela school, which cares with such an amazing community for traumatized children, teenagers. The warmth and attitude to live with established ties with all people, equal with or without handicaps. Of all this, we can learn in Germany. Let's benefit from the work of the 2 scholarship holders of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Let's create a long-lasting, sustainable network of inclusion between Brazil and Germany to learn from each other. I think this is going to be the most important task for Marco in the next time. Multilateralism is for the development of an inclusive society helpful, not such for the development of inclusion of people with handicaps, even more for the extended meaning of the concept inclusion. And especially in the present time in which many people believe in the national egoism. Inclusion needs brave people. Let's develop together brave ideas and concepts. Let's find brave employers so we can make the society in Brazil and Germany a little bit better. So I hope you understand me what my words means, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uwe. I think this is a very important message that we are building bridges and helping each other and sharing our knowledge and our expectations and our solutions as well. Thank you for your kind words. Professor Kepler, please, you can now do your statement. Welcome again.
Thank you very much for the invitation and congratulations for organizing this event. And this is exactly what we have to do, because inclusion is a global issue. And for that reason, intercultural comparisons or collaborations are so important to change ideas, to discuss issues of inclusion. And this kind of event is contributing to this process. As we also did with our books, we published 2 books, and one of them was already mentioned, the German Brazilian Guide or Handbook of Inclusion, and also a book about diversity. It's the new edition from 2019, and I'm very happy that Cid is with us because he contributed to the both, and we are very happy to do this work together in collaboration of Germany and Brazil. As Uwe Eisenberg and myself are working in the educational system, I want to pay attention to the important process relevant for the labor market. This is a transition process from school to the labor market for people with disabilities. It's a special issue I think we should not forget tonight. To enter the labor market, to get a professional formation, and from our institution, I come from the University of Dortmund, it's also entering the university as a former student of school to get an academic formation at the university. It's also a very important and difficult transition process. But we have, just to give I think a good example, a special center for students with disabilities, and this exists at TU Dortmund University already 40 years, and we are one of the few universities worldwide that paid attention already much time before we had the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And also in our academic sector, a difficult question is exchange of students, exchange programs for students with disabilities. They are many times excluded from that kind of collaboration between universities, exchange of students, and also researchers like Marco and Jonas arrived in Germany. It's also a very important topic that we pay attention for students with disabilities to also be part of our exchange activities. And also an important issue for my own environment is the further qualification for students with disabilities, like doing a PhD, for example. We had in Germany a very nice program from the federal government. It was called PROMI, Promotion Inclusive, and unfortunately it was cancelled. And we have no special financial support anymore for fostering PhD programs with students with disabilities. But at least we formed a little task force at TU Dortmund University to overcome these problems for future academic staff, future researchers with disability, because they are very important to participate in this further development of our inclusion processes in Germany, in Brazil, but also worldwide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kepler. I think now we can go to the questions. Thank you, all of you, for your very nice contributions today. Although they were all briefly contributions, they do not show deeply what the problem, what the concern of the inclusion both in Brazil and Germany are, but I think we can get an overview with your contributions today. We have some questions here at the Zoom platform. Jonas, can you read some of the questions, please, for us?
Yeah, thank you very much, our speakers. We have 3 questions. First, I would like to say welcome to our colleagues, the BUCAs, 2019 and 2020. We are very happy that some of you are attending our event today, and also the representative of the Brazilian embassy, Ms. Fernanda Lamego. You are very welcome in our event. And also the director of BRASA, the Brazilian Association, Brazil, Italy, Stefano Simoni, welcome to our event. Okay, back to our questions. I will read the questions we have, and then I think our guests could answer in this block of questions, and then if you have further, we can answer the next. So we have the first question from Arpit from India. He's asking, how can we support inclusion of people with disability in our respective workplaces in an individual capacity? And the second question from Ms. Lamego. Good evening. Does Germany have mandatory quotas for people with disabilities in the public sector and in the private sector? And the last question for the organization of our event is, why are there no women among the speakers? Are they not underrepresented in this webinar? This I'll answer. I'm sorry for the women, but we have tried to make this more diverse as possible. But because of the date and the agendas, we try to invite other women colleagues, but they were not available. So unfortunately and happily, we have 2 women representing speakers of the body, of the sign language, our guests from Germany and also from Brazil. I hope they represent us also very well. So back to our questions. The first is, how can we support inclusion of people with disability in our respective workplace in an individual capacity? I believe...
Well, can I give an example?
Yeah.
I'll give an example. I won't talk about everything that could be done, because there are many different things. But one thing that we do here in Brazil that now I'm involved with, it's companies with deaf employees. Many times when they hire the deaf employees say they are oralized, or they are able to communicate with persons with persons in general. But in the end, every day, they have problems talking to their colleagues and higher ranks. How do you say it? Not chiefs. They're chiefs. That's so. What do we do? What are you doing to these companies? We have developed an app that connects to a call center with interpreters, human interpreters, and so they use this app to communicate with their colleagues, to communicate in the work environment. So we have very good reports from companies that have adopted this application. And we're happy to provide, now that I'm not anymore in the public sector, I'm working for this company that deals with the inclusion of deaf people. And we're very happy to be able to provide this application that is really making a mark in the work of deaf people in big corporations. And let me say, it's another thing. I'm very intrigued. I'm sorry, with the De Oliveira, Dr. Christoph De Oliveira Kepler. So if you could tell us where the De Oliveira comes, it would be. I would appreciate it. Thank you.
It just came from marriage.
Okay.
Thank you for the answer, Cid.
To the German answer of our representative. I'll read again the question because to you there are two questions. So the first, which Mr. Torquato had answered, how can we support inclusion of people with disability in our respective workplace in an individual capacity? And the second question is, does Germany have a mandatory quotas for people with disabilities in the public sector and in the private sector? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Concerning supporting disabled people in your workplace, I think that's an issue that's not limited to the workplace. In general, disability is a social problem. Unless we change society, we're not gonna change anything. So individual action is not actually that important, I would say. But what always helps is to be informed about disability, about the realities of living with an impairment, to be informed about accessibility, what it would mean to make a surrounding, a workplace, communication, and so on accessible. And that always helps, because if you're the one that will point to something not working, something not being accessible, then that's less work for a disabled person to do that. So you always then put yourself like as an ally in the fight. So I think like being informed about how accessibility works, that's really something that everybody can do, and that helps a great deal. Concerning mandatory quotas, I think it's interesting that you ask for the public sector and the private sector. We have a quota for both, but it doesn't work. Or maybe, well, it doesn't work partly for the public sector, but not for the private sector. I would have to look up the exact numbers, but the huge majority of companies that would need to employ disabled people doesn't deploy any disabled people. I think the last time I heard a number was around like 75% of big companies not employing a single disabled person. The reason is that the fees are very low. So oftentimes we're talking about for Germany, I think it's like around 200 euros per month per disabled person that you're not employing, basically, that you have to employ on a quota. And of course, like considering the level of pay in Germany, that's not a lot of money. Many companies would just spend it and pay for it. That's the first reason. Second reason is that you can avoid having to pay the fees or the fines if you move part of your production to a segregated workshop. So the state will then relieve you from the fines, but actually you're then just like further spinning the wheel of segregation, because that's this employment type that I was talking about earlier, where people make no money and usually also don't make it to the labor market or don't make it into employment. And then companies can take part of their production, move it to a factory, people work there very cheap, for them will assemble. Usually that's like very easy work. And then they don't have to pay the fine, and people are in segregated labor even more so. Yeah, we could talk for hours on what else also doesn't work. But yeah, that's the general thing. The fines are just way too low. It's not still not attractive to hire disabled people.
Thank you, Frida, for your answer. I think because of the time that we agreed with the guest speakers and the audience, we could choose just another question, Jonas, and maybe the others I could forward to the speakers, and maybe they could answer that sometime after per email or something like that.
Okay, then we'll read the last question, which is addressed to Brazil and German context. What's the German and Brazilian experience with making public and workplace documents accessible? For example, screen reader friendly. It's policy in the US to make public documents accessible, but implementation is slow and technically challenging for graph-heavy documents. Thank you, Rachel. Another Bulka from our year, which is participating in our event. Give back the answer to our...
I have no information on that. I can't comment on that. Sorry.
Interesting. I take it that you are from the US, because that would usually be the place that we look to when we look to accessibility. Yeah, in Germany, I mean, accessibility architecturally is a catastrophe, but like starting from there, it usually gets worse the more abstract it gets. Yeah, also the public sector is just in the process of making the first website accessible in terms of screen reading, but also like easy read, easy language. So to simplify things, and it's still huge. Germany, for the first time, now some of the regional elections, it was the first time that they actually gave out voting information easy read. So that's like the status that we have here. That was the first step, really. The deeper you go into websites and into the documents and so on, it will not be like there won't be any accessibility left, really.
Well, let me make a last comment. It's very positive. I'm very sad to hear that companies in Germany don't comply with the law. On the other hand, German companies in Brazil are probably probably the companies that do most in terms of inclusion of persons with disabilities in labor and jobs, etc. Right, Marco? Your experience with the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, we had several events on that. So in Germany they don't comply, but in Brazil, you take the big corporations. They are examples to the Brazilian market on how to include persons with disabilities in the workplace.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Cid. Thank you, Frida, for the answers. In Brazil, some of the companies that are part of the German-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, they are very, very dedicated to the subject inclusion and diversity. In the past few years, they are working really hard on that, and we could see that from close, Cid and me. We have reached our time now. There is one last question from Brasa. If we could do that really quickly, and then we close our webinar. Jonas, can you read that one last question from Brasa, please? Let me see if you can answer that really quickly, please.
Okay. How can be effective a joint effort about supported employment methodology?
I'm not sure if I got the question correctly. Is that like talking about academic methodology or like
I think she asked, how can be affected a joint effort about supported employment methodology? I'm not quite sure.
Let me say something. Yeah. Well, people talk a lot about supported employment in Brazil. There's a lot of talk, but there's very little action. And it normally regards persons with intellectual disabilities, right? Which, you know, as we know, are the hardest group to include in the workplace. So again, in Brazil, as much as I know, a lot of talk, a lot of comments on how important supported employment is, but very little, very little is done, actually.
I think you answered correct, Cid Torquato, for what Stefano just translated to us. So thank you very much for your point of view. If Mr. Kurbjeweit would like to make a comment, okay, then I think we can.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us tonight. And today it's afternoon in Brazil, it's night in Germany. For this webinar. I hope we had a great time hearing good information from our speakers. And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Marco.
Bye-bye.
Have a good time.
Yeah.